So, before we get into the substance of this video, I want to address certain objections that emerged in the comments under the first part of this series. First, there is a text wall in the first video where I called what Kyle Rittenhouse did vigilante justice. People accused me of being ignorant about the case, which is actually not even that true, since the case was heavily medialized in Europe and people usually took sides according to their political leanings. Right-wing people supported Rittenhouse, myself included, and left-wing people accused him of being a vigilante. Because that is what we Europeans do. We have strong opinions about American issues that do not concern us and impact our lives at all. I did not really think through the negative connotations that the term vigilante carries, and I should have used another term. I am aware of the fact that he was acquainted since he was just defending himself, and he thus did not break the law and, therefore, should not be called a vigilante. More than to get into the ins and outs of this particular case, I wanted to illustrate the alien nature of the whole situation to most Europeans. In many European countries, the right to carry firearms is severely restricted, and often only people working in some kind of security occupation can own and carry guns. Luckily, that is not the case in my home country of the Czech Republic, where gun laws are very benevolent in the European context. So, the whole situation in which a guy takes his gun and goes to a violent riot where many people are armed, gets attacked and then uses his weapon to defend himself and shoots 3 people is precisely the kind of scenario that really could not and does not happen in Europe. I was not condemning his action, just using it as an example. But it is also undeniably true that this whole situation is, in its nature, a situation that usually happens in less developed countries without strict law and order situation. And that is precisely why it is an excellent example of American uniqueness. But it was not a condemnation in any way. The second point I want to address is that many Americans seem offended and got defensive about the alleged similarities of Americans to primordial hunters and gatherers that Emmanuel Todd writes about. It was not meant as an insult and was not supposed to be one of those envious, snarky European remarks belittling Americans. I was trying to describe where these precise remarks come from, but they do not express my personal views. Anyone who saw my 2-part series about the decline of Europe knows that I am aware that the American system, with all its flaws, is more competitive, innovative, and sustainable than the current European socio-economic status quo. The comparison of Americans to primordial Homo sapiens by Todd is, on the contrary, a tribute to their dynamism, innovativeness, and adaptability. And I personally thought it is intriguing and kind of badass. I hoped I had made this understandable in the video, but if I did not, that is on me. Many people also questioned the anthropological basis of the claims by Emmanuel Todd that the nuclear family was prevalent among the Pleistocene hunters and gatherers, and claimed that the nuclear family is a modern family type that emerged in northwestern Europe during the late Middle Ages and the early modern period. Sure, Emmanuel Todd definitely could be wrong, and I won't be one of those snuck-up arrogant assholes that answers to people criticizing the claims in my videos by telling them to go and read Todd's 500 pages long book that is, to be frank, pretty challenging read, and, while very interesting, I also often struggled to get through it. However, I have found a very good essay on Substack, which is not long, and it is kind of a distillation of Todd's scientific findings, and it explains why they seem to be in sync with our current scientific understanding of the issue supported by findings from archaeological sites. The essay is free to read, and it is in the description of this video, so anyone interested can read it. Also, in the first part of this series I claimed that I would include the demographic problems stemming from the apparent weakening of cultural push for monogamy in the United States. But after I started to write that part, I concluded that it would be better suited for a separate video, since it is a complex issue that needs proper time to be fully explored. It is not uniquely American, and its impacts on demographics are not yet fully apparent. I thus decided to not include it in this video. So, with this out of the way, let's go to the substance of this video. The American relationship with race and ethnicity is fascinating and complex. While I, of course, cannot offer an insight into the subject that might be offered by Americans that actually live it, I hope that my view might be able to have perks of the outsider's perspective that is not emotionally invested in the topic. So, to get into it somehow, let's see what basic categories the US Census uses to describe race and ethnicity. There are 8 basic categories you can use to describe yourself in the census: white, Hispanic and Latino, Black, Asian, mixed race, American Indian, some other race, and native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. Even from the options in the census, we can examine certain peculiarities of the American approach toward race and ethnicity. In continental Europe, what is usually present in the census is nationality. When you look at the European stats on ethnicity, you can find what amount of people of Polish, Syrian, Somali, Brazilian or Chilean ancestry live in what country. Some countries then offer geographical clusters like Asia, Africa or Europe in their data, but it is still geographically and nationally conditioned. If you were a white immigrant from South Africa, you would be classified in the Africa category. So it is not a racial or an ethnic term. This understanding of ethnicity, preconditioned by nationality, is usually understood as ancestry in America. So you can be white American of Irish or Italian ancestry, or an Asian American of Indian or Korean ancestry. It is then further complicated by the fact that Hispanic or Latino is actually not understood in racial terms, but as something that could be most accurately described as panlinguistic/geographic definition. The most coherent definition I found says that the term Hispanic is strictly limited to Spain, Puerto Rico, and all countries where Spanish is the only official language, whereas Latino includes all countries in Latin America, even Brazil, even though Portuguese is its only official language, but it does not include Spain. Under the pan-ethnic term Hispanic or Latino, people can therefore identify as any race, white, black or indigenous. To somehow describe the people that are white, but not Hispanic, the subcategory non-Hispanic white exists in the census. The Bureau defines white people as those with origins in any of the original peoples of Europe, the Middle East or North Africa. This also creates a certain distortion, since I would be so bold to claim that most people would not visually put most inhabitants of North Africa or the Middle East in the non-Hispanic white category, certainly less than Spanish people. But if you are a person from Spain migrating to America, you should be included in the Hispanic category and probably under the white Hispanic subcategory. And it is then even further complicated by the multiracial and multi-ethnicity people that can be either included in separate mixed race category, if we are excluding the category of Hispanic and Latino and are dividing people in this category by their race, or multi-ethnic category, if we include Hispanics and Latinos as a separate entity. Or they can be distributed among the white, black, Asian or other populations depending on the racial mix of their ancestors. That means that you can find relatively significant differences in the information about the racial and ethnic makeup of the United States in different sources, depending on which categories are included. You can either see white, black or Asian alone, or in combination. And you have to also watch out for Karens that found 0.5% Cherokee in their heritage results and now identify as multiracial. So, as you can see, it is kind of a mess. Interestingly enough, Britain is the only European country relatively close to this kind of census categories based on an outward appearances, so race and ethnicity, and not nationality. Britain is also the only European country with very detailed maps showing the residential ethnic makeup of different municipalities, as in America. So there is likely some kind of historical cultural continuity there. Overall, it reflects the different ethnogenesis of peoples on the different sides of the Atlantic. In Europe, modern national sensibilities are mostly based on language, and sometimes religion, as a primary determinant of one's identity and national belonging. It was not always that clear-cut, but it is the most important factor. European peoples have lived in geographically relatively limited areas, interbred with each other for centuries, especially in the central part of the continent where different ethnicities coexist without significant geographic boundaries, and are mostly not that genetically distinct from each other to have significant look differences that would make outward appearances the most basic division. The vast majority of Europeans have also been Christians since the Middle Ages. While there were significant differences in the level of socio-economic development between different parts of Europe, they were nowhere as vast as between European colonizers and Native Americans or Africans. Overall, it was only after the power of Christianity as the main ideology significantly declined from the 18th century that scientific racism, usually putting people of Germanic origin at the alleged peak of human development, became widespread. and culminated in the Nazi ideology that aimed to exterminate Eastern European Slavs and Jews considered as Untermensch. But if many of the Aryan Herrenvolk Nazi officers from Prussia, Austria or Sudetenland did the DNA heritage test, they would likely find out that half of them were at least partially Slavic and would have to burn the results before the Oberführer would find out. But in America, ethnogenesis happened through the fusion of local identities of many, often very different peoples. First, from different areas and social classes of the British Isles, and then from all over Europe. While the differences between the different ethnic groups from the British Isles and their impact on American culture is a fascinating subject, it was covered in great depth by many YouTubers with greater insight into the subject, and I thus won't get deep into that. However, Europeans in America were, from the start, confronted with the indigenous Native Americans and slaves imported from Africa, and the differences in cultural, ethnic, and developmental level between these groups was so massive that it created hard divisions between the categories that persists to this day. There was also an interest of the colonial and then independent American elites to support the cultural fusion of different European peoples, since nobody wanted to deal with the ethnic animosities from the old world in America. There was the need to create Americans. Of course, there was also the need to create an ideological justification for the continuation of race-based slavery that also contributed to the hardening of racial divisions. There are quite a lot of discussions about what precisely the term white meant throughout American history. There is a quote by Benjamin Franklin addressing the dangers of being swarmed by German immigrants. Quote, "The number of purely white people in the world is proportionably very small. All Africa is black or tawny, Asia chiefly tawny, America, exclusive of the newcomers, is wholly so. And in Europe, the Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians and Swedes are generally of what we call a swarthy complexion, as are the Germans also, the Saxons only excepted, who, with the English, make the principal body of white people on the face of the earth." End of quote. This quote itself shows that the definition of whiteness was partially also culturally determined. I mean, if Benjamin Franklin was being really strict in the matter of paleness, I can sort of understand Spaniards, Italians, maybe some of the French and Russians, but Swedes and Germans, that is kind of absurd. Swedes are some of the whitest white people out there. While this quote mentioned the skin tone of different nations, leftists often use this example, as well as the prejudices towards Irish, Italian, Western Slavic and Jewish immigrants I will speak about in a moment, to try to prove that race does not exist, it is just a social construct, and that is allegedly proven by the fact that people of European ancestry were not seen as fully white back then. But that is inaccurate. The newcomers were not seen as entirely culturally on par with the Anglo-Saxons, and it was a combination of ethnic and religious prejudice. Still, they were clearly not seen as racially inferior to the extent black people often were, and they were never racially segregated by law or enslaved. They were not seen as fully white or white enough. Still, it has to be understood in the context of the times, when the theories of qualitative categorization of different European ethnicities on racial basis were quite popular. The term was used in an anthropological and cultural meaning different from the current understanding of white people as people of European ancestry, but they were not seen as black. And quite frankly, these groups were themselves often very racist toward black people. If you were a poor immigrant who had never seen a black person before, it was probably quite tempting to indulge in the fact that there is someone even lower in the pecking order than you. So, when I speak about some ethnic group being integrated into the white American majority, I am operating with the meaning of the term in the way it was understood back then. And indeed, as the immigration from the mentioned countries increased and the newcomers integrated into the pre-existing American communities, they were included among fully white people. That happened first with Germans and Scandinavians, with the immigration from these areas culminating in the first half of the 19th century, but the broadest expansion of the term white came in the first half of the 20th century. There were two clear peaks in immigration to the United States. The first came during the break of the 19th and 20th centuries, and the second from the 1990s till today. At the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, millions of Irish, Italian, mostly from the south of Italy, Ashkenazi Jewish and Western Slavic people immigrated to the United States from Europe that was suffering from overpopulation due to the demographic transition gathering pace on large parts of the continent. and the newcomers faced some pretty hard discrimination from the get-go. It is, to a certain extent, understandable. One has to try to see the world from the perspective of the Americans of the times. Northwestern Europe and America were going through the Industrial Revolution and, in a couple of decades, basically skyrocketed into the future in terms of their civilizational development in relation to the rest of the world. Britain had an empire that included 1/4 of the surface of the world's landmass and 1/4 of the world's population. Quite naturally, many people looked at the world and said to themselves, well, only a couple of countries in the world are properly industrialized and civilized, almost exclusively in Northwestern Europe or the British colonial offshoots, and almost exclusively Protestant in their religion. Sure, the French are Catholic, but they are weird anyway, and they somehow managed to copy it from us. It is not that hard to imagine how one could get a little vain and say to himself, well, the reason for this is that we are better than everyone. Our religion is better since it promotes strong work ethics, and our genes are just better. Be honest with yourself. It is tempting to attribute all that success to your greatness. And even today, after hundreds of books were written about the subject, there is not one definitive answer to the question of why it was precisely Britain that managed to basically invent the modern world. And while it was likely a synergy of cultural, geographic, demographic and other influences, the Protestant religion and Britain's overall unique cultural and institutional development certainly played a role. And then, as you are bathing in your own greatness, millions of poor, dirty, often illiterate Catholic and Jewish people start pouring into America, since it was naturally mostly the people from lower social classes emigrating. One has to remember that the development differences between Northwestern Europe and the source countries of immigration was vast. In Ireland in the 1830s, the average life expectancy was 19 years, while it was 36 years for black slaves in America. And that was before the Irish famine. The situation in rural Sicily or rural Poland at the time was likely not that rosy either. And also, one cannot exclude the Eastern European Jews coming with their strange hats and long beards. But every one of these groups was integrated into the broad, white Anglo-Saxon American majority, usually in the span of 3 generations, where the first generations lived in ethnically segregated ghettos and often spoke close to no English, and the third generation was basically fully integrated and could not speak the language of its ancestors, except maybe a few words. Intermarriage was crucial in the process of dissolution of different ethnic groups into the mainstream white Anglo-Saxon American population. In 1989, the share of Italian Americans over 65 years with at least one parent of other than Italian American ancestry was only 5%, but 80% of the Italian American children at the time were of mixed ancestry. The number of people that just put the term white or American in the surveys increased every couple of years among the people of Italian, Irish, Polish or Jewish ancestry. America showed that it can integrate massive numbers of people of more diverse cultural origins. But then it needed time to digest the newcomers, which it did. From the 1920s on, immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe was severely restricted, and the already existing ban on Asian immigration was solidified. The foreign-born population declined from 14.7% of the population in 1910 to the lowest point of 4.7% in the early 1970s. In 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act abolished the previously accepted system of national origin quotas. By equalizing immigration policies, the act resulted in new immigration from non-European nations, which started to change the ethnic makeup of American society. The share of non-Hispanic white Americans declined from its peak of almost 90% of the population in the 1950s, when there were basically just non-Hispanic white and black people in the US, to the current levels of just under 60%. Even though the absolute number of non-Hispanic white population increased significantly throughout the second half of the century and declined for the first time just recently between the 2010 and 2020 censuses, the absolute increase in the US population as a whole was so large that it led to a rapid decrease in the non-Hispanic white population share. I will now go over the current racial and ethnic composition of the United States. I will use categories non-Hispanic white alone, non-Hispanic black alone, non-Hispanic Asian alone, and so on, and I will put multiracial people, as well as Hispanic or Latino people of all races, into separate categories, since I think it is probably the most easily understandable way to put it. Today, 57.8% of the population of the US is non-Hispanic white alone, which has a total fertility rate of around 1.6 children per woman and a median age of 43.8 years. It can thus be said that the demographic profile of non-Hispanic white Americans is very similar to Europe. But it is important to note that there is significant diversity in the reproductive behavior of the non-Hispanic white population. Some regions, for example New England, are similar to European countries like Germany or Italy, in both their low fertility and high median age. But there are also regions, for example the Mormon Belt, with the youngest population in the Western world, with median age close to 30 years, and fertility that assures natural population growth. There are also self-segregated and highly demographically dynamic religious groups like the Amish. But let's continue. 18.7% of the population are Hispanics or Latinos of any race, which have total fertility rate of around 1.9 children per woman and a median age of 30.5 years. 12.4% of the population are black people alone, which have total fertility rate of around 1.7 children per woman and median age of 34.5 years. 6% are Asians alone, which have a total fertility rate of around 1.4 children per woman and median age of 37.7 years. And 10.2% are multiracial, which have total fertility of around 1.5 children per woman and median age of 21 years. The birth rates in the US dropped significantly over the last 15 years, from 2 children per woman around 2010 to 1.65 children per woman in recent years. This decline was universal in all ethnic groups, but was more significant among the ethnic minority populations. While the non-Hispanic white fertility dropped from 1.8 children per woman in 2010 to 1.6 children per woman today, so decline of 0.2 children per woman, the fertility among Hispanic and Latino populations dropped from 2.4 children per woman in 2010 to 1.9 children per woman today, so a decrease of 0.5 children per woman. And the fertility of Black Americans dropped from 2.1 children per woman in 2010 to 1.7 children per woman, so decrease of 0.3 children per woman. The fertility of the United States Hispanic population is thus converging with the non-Hispanic white population. According to the projections, the non-Hispanic white alone share of the population will decline to under half of the US population sometime around the middle of this century, due to their lower fertility, higher median age, and continuous immigration. That has led to ecstatic celebrations on the American left, since they interpreted this as an insurance of political dominance of their coalition of white liberals and ethnic minorities. But these victorious calls were largely premature. The first thing that we need to acknowledge is that if we move away from the non-Hispanic white alone category and also include the people of Hispanic or Latino origin that self-identify as completely or partially white, the white population of the United States is 71%, since 20% of the Hispanic or Latino population identifies as white only and 50% as at least partially white. If we also include mixed ethnicity people of non-Hispanic origin with partially white background, we get to 75% of the population. I believe that it is very likely that both a very significant chunk of the Hispanic population and also of the Asian American population will culturally as well as genetically merge with the non-Hispanic white majority. And the term white will again be expanded to include the people that will culturally and increasingly also ethnically identify with the white majority. Renowned demographist Eric Kaufman wrote a great book on this subject called Whiteshift. He argues that in most of the Western world, the native ethnic majorities will inevitably decline throughout this century, but in the next century, a new ethnically mixed majority will arise that will be culturally significantly close to the symbols and values of the historic white majority ethnicities. According to Kaufman, United States and Canada will be at the forefront of this process. The key component in this equation is intermarriage, as we have already demonstrated on the non-Protestant European immigrants. Intermarriage rates are a relatively good marker of the integration of migrants into the majority ethnicity. When you marry someone, it usually, not always, means that you are, to a significant extent, accepting the values of the other side. Or at least you are not hostile towards them, since you accept them as part of your family and the future for your offsprings. In the United States, most multiracial babies have at least one white parent. In 2015, 42% of multiracial babies came from non-Hispanic white and Hispanic or Latino couples, and another 14% from non-Hispanic white and Asian couples. When I visited California in 2019, I noticed that the pairing of white men with Asian women was very prevalent. I saw those couples everywhere. That is a majority of 56% in itself. Still, Another 22% of mixed ethnicity babies have mixed ethnicity parents themselves, and significant share of those parents also have white ethnic components among their parents. The multi-ethnic people are the fastest growing group in America. Their percentage increased more than threefold between 2010 and 2020, from under 3 to over 10%. And their share will inevitably rise in the future, since every time a mixed-race person reproduces with anyone else, the offsprings are also considered mixed race, and thus mixed-race populations tend to grow exponentially after surpassing a certain threshold. I think that the current process shares many similarities with the decline of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant America between 1880 and 1960. A period in which the WASP population declined under 50% of the general population. It almost seems unbelievable from today's perspective, but in the early 1960s, 75% of Protestants disapproved of marriages between Protestants and Catholics. Also, 38% of Hispanic and 47% of Asian voters voted for Trump in 2020, which shows that the political leanings of ethnic minorities, which the Democrats were so sure about, are not all that clear-cut. So, what are you saying, you might ask? Is mass immigration a positive phenomenon that you support? Is that not in contradiction to the views you were portraying in your video about mass immigration to Europe? I will elaborate. Mass immigration is a complex issue. You have to always evaluate specific characteristics of both the sources of immigration and the characteristics of the host countries. I really believe that America and other settler British origin countries are one of the culturally best equipped societies in the world to integrate immigration. They were created by immigration, and though this immigration was originally from culturally relatively homogeneous sources, they had shown in their history that they could digest substantial immigration, even from sources that were further culturally removed from the original settlers, as the integration of various European populations have shown in the past. The high levels of individualism, lack of dense family structures, and pre-existing regional diversity based on the different social classes of the original British settlers make certain cultural diversity more easily digested as well. America is also geographically insulated from the sources of immigration from the rest of the world, except for Latin America, which makes it much easier to regulate immigration and cherry-pick economically viable migrants from the rest of the world. I would say that the number of CEOs, startup founders, entrepreneurs, and overall very high representation of various Asian Americans in the high-income groups in America shows that these immigrants are very often economically significantly beneficial to the US economy. The apex position of the United States in the world economy makes it the final destination of many scientists and professionals in various fields who study, live and work in America, where they can get paid the most for their skills. It is unlikely that wealthy people who had built a great life in the US will stand in significant cultural opposition to the system that allowed them economic ascension. Immigration from Latin America is different, more often illegal, and based on the need for cheap, unqualified labor, while also being much harder to regulate because of the long land border between the US and Mexico. But even this immigration has much more hopeful prospects for the future than, for example, the mass immigration to Europe from Africa and the Middle East. Latin America is a Christian continent with a family type relatively close to the US, specifically different types of egalitarian nuclear families. That contrasts with the European case, where the immigrants are often from Muslim-majority countries with clan-based family types, which are probably the hardest to integrate into Western societies, since people's primary loyalty often lies with their extended kinship structures. The ethnogenesis myths of the European nations are also often more exclusive, since the European nations were developing alongside each other and there was a push to distinguish themselves from the surrounding peoples, often leading to the subconscious understanding of a nation as an extension of some ancient tribe. That makes it harder to be truly culturally accepted within the majority population, since the cultural codes are more particular and harder to penetrate. US culture also still has a significant magnetism and is very influential worldwide, incentivizing integration, which is also different in Europe. I made a whole long video about the immigration situation in Europe, so I'm not going to repeat all the arguments here. Still, the immigrants from Latin America in the US seem to follow the integrational patterns shown by the previous immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. People often say that if you import third world people, you will have a third world country in the end. While this might be true in some cases, I do not think it will be true in America. When you look at it from the historical perspective, the difference in living standards and socio-economic development between Americans of Northwestern European origin and rural Irish, Jewish, Polish or Sicilian populations that poured into America might often be similar to the differences in the development between the developed countries and what we call the third world. That was showcased in the example of the Irish life expectancy of 19 years in 1840, which is really brutal. But it did not change America to Poland or Sicily. It made Sicilians and Polish Americans. But, at the same time, the fact that I believe that mass immigration and ethnic change will ultimately not fundamentally threaten America in its development does not mean that one has to support mass immigration or cannot oppose it without being morally belittled. The ethnic change in one's surroundings is a significant disruption, and many people just prefer to live surrounded by people of their culture and ethnicity. That is not wrong or immoral. What skews the debate about immigration is the omnipresent fear of being accused of racism or xenophobia if you voice these concerns. But cultural differences very often correlate with geographic distance, and the geographic distance correlates with different skin color tones. That is just the reality of the world we live in. If one enjoys life in an ethnically and culturally homogeneous community, and this is motivated by the affinity towards your own people and not by hate towards others, I cannot see how that might be morally wrong. I understand this entirely, since I live in a culturally very homogeneous country, and I like it. From the point of view of the Anglo-Saxon Protestants of the 19th century, the world that they dominated and had a great appreciation for was forever changed, and from their perspective may be ruined by the immigration from culturally more distant parts of Europe. I believe it is entirely within the rights of the citizens to vote for politicians that want to regulate immigration if they feel that their surroundings are changing too much or too fast, or there are problems connected to crime or insufficient integration, and they just do not want it. While it is very likely that in purely economic terms, America profits from immigration, which is also given by the fact that the American social benefit system incentivizes immigrants to work from the get-go, not everything in life is neatly economically calculable. People are not just economic units, but also have different needs. The value of living surrounded by people of one's own culture might not be easily put into fiscal terms, but that does not mean that it is without significant value. Even if America is culturally equipped to handle immigration better than Europe, that does not mean that open borders and unregulated immigration are a good solution. There was a 40-year period of relatively very low immigration from the 1920s till the 1960s, since Americans felt it was too much and the society needed some time to integrate the newcomers, which it did. Something similar might be needed now. So, it is complex. I believe that America will handle the mass immigration that peaked from the 1990s till today, when the share of foreign-born people reaches similar levels as in 1910. The understanding of cultural whiteness will shift to include many of the newcomers and their offsprings. That does not mean that there are no significant problems stemming from mass immigration and that the lives of ordinary people dealing with it are not negatively impacted. Governments should listen to the concerns of their citizens and act accordingly. I separated the chapter about Black Americans from the part of the video where I analyzed the overall demographic change of American society, since it is mostly its own issue with particular roots, history, and, unfortunately, at least for the time being, also its future prospects. Africans were brought to America to be used as slaves since the early 17th century. And I need to address a mistake I made in the first video on American demographics, where I said that millions of them were brought to the current United States, while the real figure was significantly lower, approximately 400,000. Sorry for that. After more than 200 years of slavery in the American South, which is obviously a deplorable practice that absolutely devastates the human capital of the enslaved populations, slavery was finally abolished in the South after 1865, after the Union won the Civil War, while it was gradually abolished in the rest of the United States even before that. But while slavery was abolished, the basic economic foundations that had made slavery so profitable, so the plantation business, before it was mechanized, continued for many decades until the early 20th century. During the century after the abolition of slavery, harsh segregational laws were still applied in the southern US states, where 90% of the African Americans had lived until 1910, and worked largely as a cheap manual agricultural labor. The combination of the emancipation attempts of black Americans, increasing pressure by the rest of the America on the southern states, and the weakening economic profitability of handwork on the plantations due to their mechanization, led to the end of segregation laws in the 1960s. Even before that, there was a massive emigration wave of black Americans from the South, mostly to the northeastern cities where the black Americans from the South found jobs in the flourishing industry. This wave continued until the 1970s, and it was one of the largest internal migration waves in history, during which about 6 million people migrated. The percentage of African Americans living in the South dropped from 90% to between 50 and 60%, and African Americans also became significantly urbanized. While the African American population keeps growing due to the above average fertility, its share in the US population has remained relatively stable for the past 100 years, around 12%. Today, almost 60 years after the end of segregation, it remains a sad fact that African Americans are what could be called an urban underclass within American society. Whether you look at the per capita income, unemployment, home ownership rates, life expectancy, infant mortality rates, drug overdose mortality rates, percentage of single mothers raising their children without father, societal trust, prison population, and also both the perpetrators and the victims of homicide and other violent crimes, African Americans are either at the end of the peloton among the major race and ethnic groups, as is the case with the economic, health, and family statistics, or are heavily overrepresented in relation to their population share, as is the case with homicides. The black-on-black crime nearly quadruples the national homicide average in America, even though it is not true, as many people have written in the comments under the previous video, that without black-on-black crime, the American homicide rate would be on par with most European countries, since murders per 100,000 people among the white Americans are still between 2 to 4 times higher than in most EU countries. But the gap would be much closer. That is true. In many major American cities, there are segregated black neighborhoods with homicide rates on par with some of the most dangerous countries in the world. The question, in the hearts and minds of many people, is why is that the case? There were whole bibliographies written about the subject, most of the books probably focusing on the racist policies of the American state, but also on the inner cultural dynamics of black Americans, like the famous work of Thomas Sowell. On every argument, you can hear a counter-argument. I won't claim to have some definitive answer, which might not even exist, but from my understanding, I would put it like this. Human and cultural capital is an essential and fragile thing that develops over centuries, and the levels of such capital that different groups possess can negatively or positively impact different groups for hundreds of years. One cannot disregard the disastrous impact of slavery and segregation on the formation of this capital, of African Americans, since when one studies the development and success of different societies, things like societal trust, quality of institutions, or the propensity for education accumulated centuries ago, still hugely influences many different societies across the globe. And it is undeniable that the ability of African Americans to build this capital was heavily restricted for hundreds of years. So, the current situation of African Americans cannot be separated from this history. But, at the same time, I think the solution to their current situation must come from within the black community. It cannot be imposed from outside by any number of affirmative action or ideas for reparation for slavery. I would say that the fixation on historical guilt is likely counterproductive in finding the solutions, even if it might come from justifiable historical truths. While the oppression of black people in America is a subject of significant importance in the American debate, mostly on the left, it seems to me that it often circles around empty declaratory virtue signaling of solidarity with black people that does not really contribute much to the progress of the issue and means little for the actual lives of African Americans. The strange thing about the African American community and its status is that it genuinely looked like it was getting better, sometimes around the end of the segregation, and then it got worse again from the 1970s on, often significantly. The most logical explanation I have heard is that relatively soon after the great migration of African Americans to the northern cities, the American industry began to lay off workers for many economic reasons. The deindustrialization of America and the worsening conditions of blue-collar workers, while having detrimental impacts on all ethnic groups, fell the hardest on the black community, since they were less qualified and thus first to be laid off and also lacked strong community institutions due to their recent arrival from the South. That took jobs from black men and, together with the impacts of female emancipation and the entering of black women into the labor force, eroded their role as the breadwinners within the family, since while black women could get employed in female-dominated, less qualified professions like assistant, shop clerk, or waitress, men lacked these options and often turned to crime to support their families. That significantly damaged the structure of black families, resulting in the catastrophic levels of single mothers within black communities today. It is a testament to the importance of complete families, since people need both their father and mother in their lives to grow up as productive members of a society, at least in most cases. Other internal cultural issues of black Americans I thought were interesting and made sense to me were the lack of strong positive examples for young males, apart from athletes and music artists, fields in which African Americans are highly successful, but which do not lead to the ascension of whole communities, as is the case with successful entrepreneurs, lawyers, doctors, or scientists. And one can seriously doubt the positive example that the contemporary rap genre can give to young black men. Overall, it is also one of the fascinating contradictions of America. You can be basically from anywhere in the world, ironically, even from contemporary Africa, or a black immigrant from the Caribbean, and you can come to the United States, be highly successful, get wealthy, and become an American. There are countless examples of people, from whatever background you can think of, that have made it. But at the same time, the troubles with the successful integration of the African American community, whose ancestors were imported as slaves, are incredibly persistent, also manifesting in significantly lower, although rising, levels of intermarriage in comparison with the other major ethnic groups. The term integration is usually connected to the cultural integration of immigrant populations in their host countries. That is obviously not the case with black Americans, since they are not immigrants. They have lived in America for centuries, longer than the ancestors of many white Americans, and while their culture is specific, it is quintessentially American. The contribution of African Americans to the cultural exports of America is massive, especially in music. Black Americans taken together are by far the richest group of African ancestry in the world. The particular history of the African Americans and their arrival to America makes it hard to find some historical analogies and look for possible solutions. But I would say that repairing the black family is the most important step, and that has to be done from within.